The blood on Sarah Hartwell's hands had barely dried when the stagecoach wheel splintered apart on a jagged boulder, sending the entire carriage lurching sideways into a ravine 10 miles outside of Naco, Arizona. And though she had thought nothing could be worse than fleeing her uncle's murder scene in Philadelphia, being stranded in the wild desert mountains of the Arizona Territory in October of 1878 with a dead driver and 3 dying passengers proved her devastatingly wrong. The crash had happened so suddenly that Sarah's mind could barely process the sequence of events. One moment they had been rattling along the mountain pass, the October sun beating down mercilessly despite the approaching winter, and the next the horses were screaming, the wood was cracking, and bodies were flying through the air like rag dolls. Sarah had hit her head against something hard, and when she came to, the world was tilted at an impossible angle and filled with dust and the copper smell of blood. She pulled herself through the shattered door of the stagecoach, her traveling dress torn and stained, her dark blonde hair falling loose from its pins. The driver, a weathered man named Bill who had been kind to her at the station, lay motionless on the rocks below, his neck bent at an angle that made Sarah's stomach turn. Inside the coach, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman traveling to meet her daughter, was breathing shallowly, blood seeping from a wound on her temple. Mr. Calloway, a merchant, was unconscious with a piece of wood impaled in his shoulder. The 4th passenger, a young man whose name Sarah had never learned, was already dead, his eyes staring blankly at the roof of the overturned coach. Sarah's nursing training, limited as it was from her 2 years helping at the Philadelphia Charity Hospital, kicked in through her shock. She checked each person methodically, her hands trembling as she assessed their injuries. Mrs. Patterson needed the wound cleaned and bandaged. Mr. Calloway needed the wood removed and the bleeding stopped, though Sarah feared doing either without proper supplies would kill him faster than leaving him be. The young man needed nothing she could provide anymore. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the rocky landscape in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Sarah climbed carefully up the ravine to the road, hoping to see signs of other travelers, but the rough mountain pass stretched empty in both directions. They had seen no other traffic all day, and the driver had mentioned this route was less traveled since the Apache troubles the year before. She made her way back down to the wreckage, her practical boots slipping on loose stones. The stagecoach had fallen about 20 feet, landing wedged between 2 large boulders that had probably saved them all from rolling even further down the mountainside. The horses, still hitched, had not survived the fall. Sarah forced herself not to look at their broken bodies as she searched through the wreckage for anything useful. The small trunk that had contained food supplies for the journey had burst open, its contents scattered and destroyed. Sarah found a crushed loaf of bread, now covered in dirt and inedible. A wheel of cheese had rolled somewhere down the ravine, lost among the rocks. A jar of preserves had shattered, its contents seeping into the dry earth. She managed to salvage a single canteen of water, perhaps 2 days' worth if she rationed it carefully, and a small tin of crackers that had somehow remained intact. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped dramatically. Sarah had heard about desert nights being cold, but the reality of it was shocking after the blazing heat of the day. She pulled blankets from the coach, covering Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Calloway as best she could. The dead she could do nothing for except close their eyes and murmur a prayer her mother had taught her years ago. Mrs. Patterson regained consciousness briefly around midnight. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice weak. "There was an accident," Sarah said gently, holding the canteen to the woman's lips. "We went off the road. Help will come soon." It was a lie, but a kind one. Sarah had no idea when or if help would come. The stagecoach had been traveling from the rail station to Naco, expected to arrive by evening. When they did not arrive, would anyone come looking? And would they think to search this particular route? Mrs. Patterson drank a small sip and then faded back into unconsciousness. Sarah sat with her back against a boulder, the thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders, doing little against the cold. She had killed a man less than a week ago. Her uncle, her father's brother, who had taken her in after her parents died of fever. He had seemed kind at first, but kindness had turned to unwanted attention, and attention had turned to force. When he had come to her room that night, drunk and determined, Sarah had grabbed the fireplace poker and swung it with all her strength. The sound it made connecting with his skull would haunt her forever. She had not stayed to see if he would survive. She had grabbed what money she had saved, a single bag of belongings, and fled to the rail station, buying a ticket as far west as her funds would take her. Naco, Arizona, where the advertisement had promised work for women of good character in the growing town. A fresh start, far from Philadelphia and the life she had destroyed in one moment of desperate self-defense. Now she might die here in the desert, her fresh start buried in an unmarked grave in a ravine. The second day was worse than the first. The sun rose without mercy, turning the ravine into an oven. Mr. Calloway developed a fever, his forehead burning to the touch. Mrs. Patterson had not regained consciousness since the night before. Sarah gave them each tiny sips of water, knowing she was running out but unable to let them suffer. Her own lips were cracked and bleeding, her throat so dry that swallowing hurt. She tried to climb to the road again to wave down potential travelers, but the sun was too intense, and her head spun with dehydration and the lingering effects of her own injuries from the crash. She made it halfway before she had to turn back, defeated. By the third day, the water was gone. Sarah had given the last drops to Mrs. Patterson, who was barely breathing now. Mr. Calloway's fever had broken, but he had not woken, and Sarah suspected he would not. She sat in the narrow strip of shade provided by the overturned coach and tried not to think about dying of thirst. Her tongue felt swollen in her mouth, and her thoughts were becoming confused, jumping from her childhood in Philadelphia to her mother's face, to the feel of the poker in her hands. She must have fallen asleep or unconscious, because when she opened her eyes, the sun had moved, and there was a shadow falling across her that did not belong to the coach. Sarah blinked, trying to focus, and saw a man standing above her. He was the largest man she had ever seen, easily over 6 feet tall with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun. His hair was dark brown and long, falling past his shoulders in waves that looked like they had been tied back but had come loose. His face was tanned and weathered, with a strong jaw covered in several days of beard growth, and his eyes were a startling pale blue that seemed to see right through her. He wore buckskin trousers and a leather vest over a homespun shirt, and there was a rifle slung across his back. "Water," Sarah croaked, her voice barely audible. The man knelt down beside her, moving with surprising grace for someone so large. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder and held it to her lips. "Slow," he said, his voice deep and rough from what sounded like disuse. "Small sips, or you will be sick." Sarah wanted to gulp the water down, but his large hand controlled the canteen, tipping it carefully so she could only take small mouthfuls. The water was cool and tasted better than anything she had ever drunk in her life. After a few sips, he pulled it away despite her whimper of protest. "More soon," he said. "Too much now is bad." He moved to examine the others, his face grim as he checked Mrs. Patterson's pulse, then Mr. Calloway's. "How long?" "3 days," Sarah managed to say. "Since the crash. 3 days." The man nodded slowly, his expression unchanging. He moved with purposeful efficiency, checking the bodies of the dead, examining the wreckage, taking in the whole scene. Then he returned to Sarah and lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all, carrying her to a more shaded spot away from the coach. "I will be back," he said, settling her against a smooth rock. "I need to hunt. You need food and more water than I carry." "The others," Sarah protested weakly. "The old woman will not last the night," he said bluntly. "The man might not. But you I can save if you do what I say." He gave her another careful drink from his canteen, then placed it beside her. "Small sips. I will be back before dark." Sarah wanted to argue, to demand he do something for Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Calloway, but she barely had the strength to hold the canteen. She watched as the large man scaled the ravine wall with shocking ease, his powerful muscles moving under his shirt as he climbed. At the top, he paused and looked back down at her, his pale blue eyes meeting hers across the distance. And then he was gone. She did not know if he was real or a hallucination born of dehydration and desperation. But the canteen beside her was real, and the water in it was real. And so she held on to both and waited. True to his word, he returned before sunset. Sarah heard him before she saw him, the sound of rocks shifting as he climbed down into the ravine. He carried a dead rabbit in one hand and a leather pouch in the other. He had also somehow acquired a large skin of water that he must have retrieved from wherever he had been staying. Without speaking, he built a small fire using dried brush and deadwood from the ravine, arranging the stones in a way that suggested he had done this thousands of times before. He skinned and cleaned the rabbit with swift, practiced movements, then set it to roast over the flames. The smell of cooking meat made Sarah's empty stomach clench painfully. While the rabbit cooked, the man checked on Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Calloway again. He gave them each some water, though Sarah could see from his expression that he thought it was futile. Mrs. Patterson's breathing had become ragged and shallow. "What is your name?" Sarah asked as he returned to the fire. He was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer. Then, "Xander Ironwood." "I'm Sarah Hartwell." He nodded once, acknowledging this, and turned the rabbit on its spit. The silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. There was something solid and reassuring about his presence, as if nothing bad could happen while he was there. When the rabbit was cooked, he pulled off a small piece of meat and handed it to her. "Eat slow," he instructed. "Small bites. Your stomach is empty too long." Sarah obeyed, forcing herself to chew thoroughly and swallow slowly, even though she wanted to devour the entire rabbit. The meat was plain, seasoned only with the smoke from the fire, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. Xander watched her carefully, and when she finished the first piece, he gave her another, then another, rationing her portions with the same care he had shown with the water. He ate his own portion in silence, his eyes constantly scanning the ravine walls and the darkening sky. When they had finished, he gave her more water, then banked the fire. "You will sleep," he said. It was not a question or a suggestion, but a statement of fact. "I will watch." "You need to rest too," Sarah protested. "I will rest when you are safe." He settled himself against a boulder where he could see both the approach from above and the coach with the injured passengers. The rifle lay across his lap, and even in the fading light, Sarah could see the way his large hands rested on it with easy familiarity. She wanted to stay awake, to talk to him and understand who he was and why he was here, but her exhausted body had other ideas. With food and water in her belly and someone standing watch, she fell into the first real sleep she had had since the crash. She woke several times during the night. Each time, Xander was exactly where he had been, still and watchful as a statue. Once, she woke to hear him moving around and realized he was checking on Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Calloway. When he returned to his post, she saw the grim set of his jaw even in the moonlight and knew that Mrs. Patterson was gone. When dawn broke, Sarah found Xander already up, the fire rebuilt and more rabbit from the night before warming on stones near the flames. He handed her a portion without speaking, then gave her water. His movements were efficient and economical, wasting no energy on unnecessary actions. "Mrs. Patterson?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Passed in the night. Peaceful." He gestured to where he had covered her body with a blanket. "The man still lives, stronger than he looks." Sarah ate her breakfast slowly, as Xander had taught her, and felt strength beginning to return to her limbs. Her head was clearer today, the fog of dehydration lifting. She could think more rationally about their situation. "How did you find us?" she asked. Xander was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "I live in these mountains. I was checking my trap lines when I saw the buzzards circling 3 days ago. Took me time to locate what they found. This ravine is hidden from the road." "You have been watching us for 3 days?" Sarah was not sure whether to be grateful or disturbed. "I saw the wreckage 3 days ago," he corrected, "but I was 2 days' walk from my camp. I came back as fast as I could with supplies." He looked at her directly, his pale blue eyes intense. "If I had been closer, I would have been here sooner." There was something in his voice, an unexpected note of regret or perhaps guilt, that made Sarah's chest tighten. This rough mountain man, who spoke so little and showed so little emotion, had pushed himself to reach strangers in trouble. "Thank you," she said softly. "You saved my life." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Not saved yet. We need to get you out of this ravine. There's weather coming." Sarah looked up at the sky, which seemed clear and blue to her, but Xander was already moving, gathering supplies and examining the ravine walls. He selected a spot where the slope was less steep and where there were more handholds in the rock face. "Can you climb?" he asked Sarah. She looked up at the 20-foot ascent and felt her courage waver. But she had not survived Philadelphia, the journey west, and 3 days in the desert to give up now. "I can try. I will help you." He moved to Mr. Calloway, checking his condition. The merchant was still unconscious but breathing more steadily. "I will take him up first. He's too heavy for you to help with. Then I will come back for you." Sarah watched in amazement as Xander fashioned a sort of harness from rope he had brought, securing Mr. Calloway to his back. Then, carrying the dead weight of an adult man plus his own considerable size, Xander climbed the ravine wall. His muscles strained with the effort, his forearms corded with tension, and his broad back rippling beneath his shirt, but he made it to the top without pausing to rest. He was gone for perhaps 20 minutes, presumably settling Mr. Calloway somewhere safe. And then he was climbing back down. This time, when he reached the bottom, he held out his hand to Sarah. "Your turn," he said. Sarah took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm and the strength in his grip. "What about the others? Mrs. Patterson and the driver and the young man?" "I will come back with help to retrieve them properly," Xander said. "Right now, the living need to reach safety." He helped Sarah to the base of the climb, then positioned himself below and slightly to the side of her. "Climb steady. Do not look down. I will guide your feet to the holds." Sarah had never climbed anything in her life beyond a ladder, but she placed her hands on the rock and pulled herself up. Her arms shook with effort, and her legs felt weak, but every time she faltered, Xander's deep voice was there, calm and steady, telling her where to place her hand next, where to put her foot. Once, she slipped, her boot losing purchase on the rock, and she gasped in terror. But Xander was there instantly, his large hand on her back, steadying her, holding her against the rock face until she found her footing again. "I have you," he said, and somehow Sarah believed him completely. When she finally pulled herself over the edge of the ravine onto the road, she collapsed onto her back, gasping and trembling. Xander climbed up after her with ease, barely winded despite the exertion of 2 climbs carrying heavy loads. He allowed her only a moment to rest before helping her to her feet. "My camp is 4 miles north," he said. "Can you walk?" Sarah looked at the rough mountain terrain stretching before them and wanted to cry. But Xander was already moving, lifting Mr. Calloway onto his shoulders again with a grunt of effort, and she found herself following. 4 miles. She had walked further than that many times in Philadelphia. She could do this. The journey was the longest of Sarah's life. The terrain was rocky and uneven, the sun beating down mercilessly as the morning wore on. Her legs ached, her head pounded, and several times she stumbled and nearly fell. But each time, Xander was there, steadying her with his free hand, waiting patiently while she caught her breath, offering her water from his canteen. He did not speak much during the walk, conserving his energy for carrying Mr. Calloway, but his presence was constant and reassuring. Sarah found herself watching him as they walked, noting the way he moved through the rough terrain with confidence, how he seemed to know exactly where to place his feet, how his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. He was completely at home here in the wilderness, as much a part of the landscape as the rocks and the scrub brush. When they finally reached his camp, Sarah could have wept with relief. It was tucked into a small canyon, hidden from view unless you knew exactly where to look. There was a crude shelter built against the canyon wall, constructed of wood and animal hides, and a fire pit ringed with stones. A small stream ran through one side of the canyon, the sound of running water, the most beautiful thing Sarah had heard in days. Xander settled Mr. Calloway in the shelter, arranging blankets around him and checking his wound. Then he turned to Sarah, who was swaying on her feet. "Sit," he commanded, guiding her to a spot near the fire pit. "Rest." Sarah sat, and the moment she did, exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. She watched through heavy-lidded eyes as Xander built up a fire, set a pot of water to boil, and began preparing some kind of meal. His movements were practiced and efficient, and there was something almost meditative about watching him work. "You live here alone?" she asked, her curiosity overcoming her fatigue. Yes." "For how long?" He was quiet for a long moment. 5 years? Maybe 6. I lost count. Sarah tried to imagine living alone in the wilderness for 5 or 6 years and could not fathom it. "Do you ever go into town?" "Sometimes. For supplies I cannot hunt or make." He added something to the pot, stirring it with a wooden spoon. "Not often. Why do you live out here?" Xander's hand stilled on the spoon. When he spoke, his voice was even rougher than usual. "Because out here there is no war, no killing, no orders to follow that go against everything right." He looked up at her, his pale blue eyes haunted. "Out here, a man can be left alone with his thoughts, even if those thoughts are dark." Sarah understood more than he probably realized. She too was running from something, seeking solitude and a fresh start far from the life she had known. "The war," she said softly. "You fought." "I fought." He returned his attention to the pot. "I survived. Many did not. Coming out here seemed better than bringing the war home with me." They sat in silence after that, but it was a companionable silence, the understanding between two people who carried their own burdens. When the stew was ready, Xander served her a bowl, and Sarah ate gratefully. It was made with dried meat and wild vegetables, seasoned with herbs she did not recognize, and it was hearty and filling. After the meal, Xander checked on Mr. Calloway again, changing the bandage Sarah had managed to apply in the ravine. The wound was ugly and infected, but Xander cleaned it with something from a small pouch, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked. "Will he live?" Sarah asked. "Maybe. He is strong, and the fever has broken. But infection is unpredictable." Xander finished bandaging the wound and covered Mr. Calloway with more blankets. "Time will tell." He turned to Sarah then, his eyes scanning her face with unexpected intensity. "You need to rest properly. The shelter is yours while you recover. I will sleep outside." "I cannot take your shelter," Sarah protested. "You have done so much already." "You will take the shelter," Xander said firmly, in a tone that brooked no argument. "You have been through an ordeal. Your body needs rest to heal." Sarah was too tired to argue further. She let Xander help her to the shelter, where he had already arranged blankets into a surprisingly comfortable bed. The space was small but clean, and it smelled of wood smoke and leather. There were a few personal items visible: a spare set of clothes hanging on pegs, a hunting knife in a sheath, a battered book that looked like it had been read many times. "Thank you, Xander," Sarah said, settling onto the blankets. "For everything." He nodded once, that same uncomfortable reaction to gratitude, and ducked out of the shelter. Sarah pulled the blankets around herself and fell asleep almost instantly. She slept for nearly 12 hours straight, her exhausted body finally able to rest fully now that she was safe and warm and fed. When she woke, it was full dark outside, and she could see the glow of the fire through the gaps in the shelter walls. She emerged to find Xander sitting by the fire, working on something with his hands. As she approached, she saw he was fletching arrows, his large fingers surprisingly deft as they worked. "You should still be resting," he said without looking up. "I have rested enough." Sarah sat down across the fire from him. "How is Mr. Calloway?" "The same, still unconscious but stable." Xander finished the arrow he was working on and set it aside. "You should eat." He heated up more stew and gave her a bowl, watching to make sure she ate it all. Sarah was becoming accustomed to his silent caretaking, the way he provided for her needs without being asked and without expecting thanks. "The stagecoach was supposed to arrive in Naco 3 days ago," Sarah said. "Will they send someone to search for it?" "Probably, but this route is not direct. They will search the main road first." Xander poked at the fire with a stick. "I will need to go down to Naco myself in a few days, let them know what happened and where to find the bodies." "A few days? Should we not go as soon as possible?" "You are not strong enough for the journey yet. It is a full day's walk to Naco from here, rough terrain. You need to build back your strength." He looked at her seriously. "Pushing too hard too fast will do more harm than good." Sarah knew he was right, though she chafed at the delay. She had been so close to reaching Naco, to starting her new life, and now she was stranded in the wilderness with a man she barely knew. Except she did know him in a way. She knew he was kind despite his rough exterior, that he was strong and capable and unafraid. She knew he had fought in a war that had left him scarred in ways that did not show on his body. She knew he was a man who kept his word and took care of those weaker than himself without expecting anything in return. Over the next few days, Sarah's strength gradually returned. Xander hunted every day, bringing back rabbits, quail, and once a small deer. He showed her how to prepare the meat, how to preserve it by smoking and drying. He taught her which plants in the canyon were edible and which were poisonous. Pointing them out during short walks he encouraged her to take to rebuild her stamina. Sarah found herself watching him constantly, fascinated by his competence and self-sufficiency. The way his muscles flexed when he drew his bow, the concentration on his face as he cleaned and skinned his kills, the surprising gentleness in his large hands when he changed Mr. Calloway's bandages or offered her water. He was unlike any man she had ever met in Philadelphia, where the gentlemen wore fine suits and prided themselves on their manners and education. Xander's education came from the wilderness itself, and his manners were rough but honest. On the fourth day after their arrival at his camp, Mr. Calloway finally regained consciousness. His eyes fluttered open while Sarah was sitting with him, and he looked around in confusion. "Where am I?" he croaked. "You are safe," Sarah said quickly, giving him water. "There was an accident with the stagecoach. You were badly injured, but you're going to be all right." Mr. Calloway's memories seemed to come back slowly. He asked about the other passengers, and Sarah had to tell him about Mrs. Patterson and the others, his face crumpled with grief and shock. Xander examined Mr. Calloway's wound and pronounced him on the mend, though it would be weeks before he was fully recovered. The merchant was weak and confused, sleeping most of the time, but his presence changed the dynamic in the camp. Sarah now had another person to care for, which gave her purpose and kept her occupied. It also meant she spent less time with Xander, who seemed to retreat into himself when Mr. Calloway was awake. He went out hunting more often and stayed away longer. Sarah found herself missing his quiet presence, the way he would sit across the fire from her in the evenings and work on his arrows or mend his clothes while she talked about her life in Philadelphia, carefully leaving out the parts about her uncle and why she had really fled. On the sixth day, Xander announced that he would be leaving for Naco the next morning. "Mr. Calloway is stable enough to be left for a day," he said. "I will bring back help to transport him properly and supplies you both will need." "I could go with you," Sarah offered. Xander shook his head. "Someone needs to stay with him. If his fever returns or the wound worsens, he will need care." He looked at her seriously. "Can you handle a rifle?" Sarah thought of the fireplace poker, the weight of it in her hands, the terrible sound it had made. "I can learn." He spent the rest of the day teaching her to load and fire his spare rifle, setting up targets in the canyon and correcting her stance and aim with patient persistence. Sarah had never handled a gun before, and the kick of the rifle startled her the first few times, but Xander's steady presence behind her, his large hands adjusting her grip, and his deep voice in her ear giving instructions, made her feel safe despite her nervousness. "You're a quick learner," he said after she managed to hit the target 3 times in a row. There was something in his voice that might have been approval, and Sarah felt an unexpected warmth at the praise. That evening, Xander prepared more food than usual, leaving Sarah with enough provisions for several days. He checked and rechecked his supplies, his movements almost nervous, though Sarah could not imagine this confident mountain man being nervous about anything. "I will be back by nightfall tomorrow," he said as he banked the fire for the evening. "Sooner if possible." "Be careful," Sarah said, and was surprised by how much she meant it. The thought of Xander not returning, of being left alone here with only the injured Mr. Calloway, filled her with unexpected anxiety. He looked at her across the fire, his pale blue eyes reflecting the flames. "I have survived in these mountains for 6 years. I will survive 1 more day." But Sarah noticed he did not make the same flippant dismissal of her concern that he usually did with her thanks. Instead, he held her gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of a connection that had formed over these days of survival and care. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn to find Xander already preparing to leave. He had his rifle slung across his back, his knife at his belt, and a pack with supplies. In the early morning light, he looked almost mythical, like some ancient warrior preparing for battle. "Remember what I taught you about the rifle," he said. "If you see anyone approach who is not me, you shoot first and ask questions later." "I will." Sarah stood, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. "Xander, She paused, not sure what she wanted to say. "Thank you" seemed inadequate. "Be safe" seemed presumptuous. Instead, she simply said, "I will see you tonight." He nodded once, and then he was gone, climbing out of the canyon with the same easy grace he did everything. Sarah watched until he disappeared from view, feeling oddly bereft. The day passed slowly. Sarah tended to Mr. Calloway, who was awake more often now and able to eat solid food. She kept the fire going, rationed their water, and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. What if Xander was injured on the journey? What if he decided not to come back? What if he brought back authorities who somehow knew about what she had done in Philadelphia? That last fear was irrational, she knew. There was no way anyone here could know about her uncle. But guilt had a way of making every interaction feel like a potential exposure. As evening approached, Sarah found herself watching the canyon entrance compulsively, jumping at every sound. Mr. Calloway had fallen back asleep, his breathing steady and even, and Sarah paced the camp restlessly. When Xander finally appeared, climbing down into the canyon as the sun was setting, Sarah felt relief so intense it made her dizzy. He was not alone. 2 men followed him, both carrying supplies, and behind them came a horse-drawn wagon driven by a 4th man. "Sarah Hartwell," Xander said, his voice formal in a way it had not been when they were alone. "This is Sheriff Tom Morrison, Doc Henry Wells, and Carl Fletcher who brought the wagon." Sarah greeted them politely, very aware of the questions in their eyes as they looked between her and Xander. The sheriff was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes that took in every detail of the camp, the injured Mr. Calloway, and Sarah's disheveled appearance. "Miss Hartwell," he said, tipping his hat, "Xander here told us about the accident. Terrible business. We will need to recover the bodies and investigate what happened." "Of course," Sarah said. "I will tell you everything I remember." Doc Wells examined Mr. Calloway and declared him stable enough to be moved, though he would need continued care in town. Carl Fletcher proved to be a gentle giant of a man who helped load Mr. Calloway into the wagon with surprising care. Sheriff Morrison questioned Sarah about the accident while Doc Wells worked. She told him everything, starting from when they left the station to when the wheel broke to the days stranded in the ravine. She did not mention how close to death they had all come or how Xander had saved her life. She kept her voice steady and factual, the way she had been trained at the hospital. "And Xander found you 3 days after the accident?" the sheriff asked, making notes. "Yes, I thought we were all going to die before help arrived." The sheriff looked at Xander, who stood apart from the group, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "Lucky thing you were checking your trap lines when you were." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Xander said flatly. "I check that area every week this time of year." Sheriff Morrison nodded slowly, then turned back to Sarah. "We will need to recover the bodies tomorrow. Can you show us where the accident happened?" "Yes, though I am not sure how helpful I will be with directions. Xander is the one who knows these mountains." "I will take you there," Xander said. "First light." The sheriff seemed satisfied with this. He and the others settled into camp for the night, since it was too dark to travel safely. Carl had brought extra supplies, including coffee, which they brewed over Xander's fire. The men talked in low voices about the accident, about the state of the roads, about Apache activity in the area. Sarah noticed how uncomfortable Xander seemed with the other men in his space. He sat slightly apart from the group, contributing little to the conversation, his eyes frequently drifting to her. Whenever their gazes met, he would look away quickly, but not before Sarah saw something in his expression that made her heart beat faster. That night, Sarah slept in the shelter while the men slept around the fire. She could hear their low voices and occasional laughter, so different from the quiet evenings she had spent alone with Xander. She found herself missing those evenings, missing the comfortable silence and the way he would sometimes tell her about the animals he had seen that day, or point out constellations in the night sky. In the morning, Xander led Sheriff Morrison, Carl, and 2 other men who had arrived at dawn to the ravine where the stagecoach had crashed. Sarah stayed at the camp with Doc Wells and Mr. Calloway, who was awake and asking questions about what would happen next. "You will need to stay in Naco for a few weeks while you recover," Doc Wells said. "The hotel has rooms and I can check on you daily." "And Miss Hartwell?" Mr. Calloway asked. "I suppose she will come to town as well. She was traveling to Naco when the accident happened, was she not?" Sarah had almost forgotten about her original plan. Yes, she had been traveling to Naco to start a new life, to find work and disappear into anonymity. But now, sitting in Xander's camp in the canyon, the thought of going to town felt wrong somehow. When Xander and the others returned that afternoon with the bodies respectfully wrapped and loaded into the wagon, Sarah felt a deep sadness wash over her. Mrs. Patterson, the driver Bill, the young man whose name she had never learned they deserved better than to die in a ravine far from home. "We will bury them in Naco," Sheriff Morrison said. "Give them a proper Christian burial. Miss Hartwell, will you be ready to travel to town in the morning?" Sarah looked at Xander, who stood apart from the group again, his face unreadable. She wanted to ask him what he thought, whether he wanted her to go or stay, but she could not in front of all these other people. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I will be ready." That evening, after the others had bedded down for the night, Sarah found Xander sitting by the stream, away from the camp. She approached quietly, not wanting to startle him. "May I join you?" she asked. He nodded, and she sat down on a flat rock near him. The sound of the water rushing over stones filled the silence between them. "Thank you for everything you have done," Sarah said. "I know I have said it before, but I do not think you understand how grateful I am. You saved my life, Xander." "You do not need to keep thanking me," he said, his voice rough. "Any decent person would have done the same." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Any decent person would have taken me to town immediately and been done with me. You took me to your home. You hunted for me, taught me skills I needed, made sure I was strong enough before forcing me to travel. You cared for me." She paused, then added softly, "I will miss this place. I will miss our evenings by the fire." Xander was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible over the stream. "I will miss them too." Sarah's heart clenched. "Then ask me to stay." He turned to look at her then, his pale blue eyes intense in the moonlight. "I cannot ask that of you. You were traveling to Naco for a reason, to start a new life. You have plans, a future waiting for you." "My plans were to escape my past, not to pursue any particular future," Sarah said, surprised by her own honesty. "I was running away, Xander, just like you ran away after the war." "What were you running from?" Sarah took a deep breath. She had not told anyone the truth, had not planned to ever tell anyone. But Xander had shared his darkness with her, his reasons for hiding in the mountains. He deserved the same honesty. "I killed a man," she said quietly. "My uncle. He took me in after my parents died, and he seemed kind at first. But then he started looking at me differently, saying inappropriate things. And then one night he came to my room, drunk, and he tried to force himself on me. I grabbed a fireplace poker and hit him as hard as I could. I do not even know if he died or if I just injured him. I ran before I could find out." She expected shock, disgust, judgment. But Xander just looked at her steadily, his expression thoughtful. "He deserved what he got," Xander said finally. "Any man who forces himself on a woman deserves worse." The simple acceptance in his voice, the lack of judgment, made tears spring to Sarah's eyes. "I have been so afraid," she admitted. "Afraid someone will find out, afraid I will be arrested and hanged, afraid that I am a terrible person for not feeling more guilty about it." "You are not a terrible person. You defended yourself." Xander shifted closer to her on the rocks, and Sarah felt the warmth of his large body next to hers. "Out here, no one will find you. No one will ask questions you do not want to answer. Out here, you can be whoever you want to be." "Is that what you do? Be whoever you want to be?" "I try to be no one at all," Xander said. "Invisible, apart from the world and its violence." "But you are not no one," Sarah said. "You are a good man. Xander Ironwood, one of the best I have ever met." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a scoff. "You do not know me. I know enough. I know you traveled for 2 days to help strangers. I know you gave up your shelter for me and slept on the cold ground. I know you taught me how to survive in this place and never once made me feel like a burden. I know you are strong and capable and kind, even though you try to hide it." She turned to face him fully. "I know I feel safer with you than I have ever felt with anyone in my life." Xander was staring at her now, and Sarah could see something shift in his expression, a crack forming in the wall he kept around himself. "Sarah," he said, her name rough on his tongue, "if you stay here, your life will be hard. I can provide food and shelter, but I cannot give you the things a woman needs: pretty dresses, society, a proper home. I do not need those things. I never wanted them, really. My mother wanted them for me. And after she died, I thought I had to want them too. But I was never happy in Philadelphia, Xander. I never felt like I belonged there. She reached out tentatively and placed her hand over his where it rested on the rock between them. His hand was so much larger than hers, roughened by work and weather. Here, in these mountains, even after everything terrible that happened, I feel more alive than I have in years. Xander looked down at their hands, then slowly, carefully, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. The gesture was almost unbearably intimate. I am not good with words, he said quietly. I have lived alone for so long, I have forgotten how to be with people. But these past days with you here, I have remembered what it feels like to not be alone, and I find I do not want to go back to the way things were. Sarah's breath caught. Then let me stay. Teach me how to live here. Let me be part of your life. It is not proper, Xander said, but there was no conviction in his voice. A man and a woman living alone, not married people, will talk. Then we will not tell people, or we will tell them we are married, or we will not care what they think. Sarah squeezed his hand. I have spent my whole life doing what was proper, Xander. Where did it get me? Running across the country with blood on my hands. I am done with proper. Xander studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah could see the war happening behind his eyes. The part of him that wanted to protect her from hardship, battling with the part that wanted to keep her close. Finally, he said, The winters are harsh here. The summers are brutal. There will be days when I can barely feed us, let alone provide comforts. You will have to work hard, learn skills you never imagined needing, and there will be danger animals, weather, the occasional desperado passing through. I can protect you, but I cannot guarantee your safety always. I understand, Sarah said. I'm not afraid. You should be. I'm afraid for you. Then we will be afraid together. Sarah leaned closer to him, close enough to see the individual whiskers in his beard, the exact shade of blue of his eyes. Please, Xander, let me stay. He reached up with his free hand and touched her face gently, his calloused fingers tracing her cheekbone with a tenderness that made Sarah's heart ache. If you stay, he said quietly, I will not be able to let you go again. Do you understand that? I do not want to be let go. Xander made a sound deep in his throat, and then he was kissing her. His lips rough and insistent on hers. Sarah melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt. The kiss was everything she had never known she wanted, passionate and genuine and full of unspoken promises. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xander rested his forehead against hers. You are sure? He asked one more time. I have never been more sure of anything, Sarah said. They sat by the stream for a long time after that, holding each other as the night deepened around them, making quiet plans for a future Sarah had not dared to imagine a week ago. In the morning, when Sheriff Morrison asked if Sarah was ready to go to town, she took a deep breath and said, Actually, I have decided to stay here. Xander has offered me work helping him with his trap lines, and I have accepted. The sheriff's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. Miss Hartwell, I am not sure that is appropriate. A young lady living alone with a man in the wilderness? We will be married, Xander said firmly, stepping up beside Sarah. His hand found hers, their fingers lacing together in front of everyone. As soon as you can bring a preacher up here to perform the ceremony. Sheriff Morrison looked between them, clearly skeptical, but unable to argue with the determination in both their faces. Well, he said finally, congratulations, I suppose. I will send word to Reverend Matthews. Mr. Calloway, being loaded into the wagon, called out, Miss Hartwell, are you certain you barely know this man? I know him well enough, Sarah said, and realized it was true. She knew the things that mattered about Xander Ironwood, his character, his kindness, his strength. The rest they would learn together. After the wagon pulled away, carrying Mr. Calloway and the bodies of the dead back to Naco, Sarah and Xander stood together at the entrance to the canyon, watching until they disappeared from sight. Are you sure? Xander asked her again, his voice quiet. Sarah turned to him and rose up on her toes to kiss him softly. Stop asking me that. I am staying, and we are getting married, and we are going to build a life together. Now show me what else I need to learn to survive in these mountains. A smile spread across Xander's face, the first real smile Sarah had seen from him, and it transformed his entire appearance. He looked younger, less burdened, almost happy. "All right then, Miss Hartwell," he said. "Lesson 1. How to fish in a mountain stream." Over the next 2 weeks, while they waited for Reverend Matthews to make the journey up to the canyon, Sarah learned more than she had learned in her entire life. Xander was an excellent teacher, patient and thorough. He taught her to fish, to track animals, to identify useful plants. He showed her how to cure hides and preserve meat, how to build and maintain a fire in any weather, how to read the signs of approaching storms. But more than the practical skills, Sarah learned about Xander himself. She learned that he hummed tunelessly while he worked, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was comfortable, that he was surprisingly well-read for someone who had lived in isolation for years. The battered book she had seen in his shelter was a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman, which he read from sometimes in the evenings. She learned that he had nightmares from the war, waking sometimes in the night with a gasp and reaching for his rifle. The first time it happened after Sarah had moved into the shelter with him, she woke to find him sitting bolt upright, his breathing harsh and his eyes wild. "You are safe," she said softly, placing her hand on his back. "You are in the canyon. There is no danger here." He calmed slowly under her touch, eventually lying back down and pulling her into his arms. "I am sorry," he murmured against her hair. "I did not mean to wake you. Do not apologize. We all have things that haunt us." Sarah pressed closer to his warmth, feeling his heart beating strong and steady against her cheek. "What haunts you?" he asked. "The sound the poker made when it hit my uncle's skull," Sarah admitted. "Sometimes I hear it when I'm trying to fall asleep, and I wonder if he is dead, if he survived, if he's looking for me." "Even if he survived, he will never find you here," Xander said fiercely. "I will make sure of that." "I know." And she did know, completely and without reservation. Xander would protect her with his life if necessary. It was both comforting and slightly terrifying to be the object of such devotion. They also learned about each other in more intimate ways. The first night Sarah moved into the shelter, they lay side by side on the blankets, both acutely aware of the other's presence. Xander kept a respectful distance, not even touching her, until Sarah finally huffed in frustration and moved closer, tucking herself against his side. "I'm going to be your wife," she said. "You are allowed to touch me." She felt, rather than heard his laugh, a rumble in his chest. "I'm trying to be a gentleman." "I do not need a gentleman. I need you." Sarah tilted her head up to kiss him, and the kiss quickly deepened into something heated and desperate. Xander pulled back with visible effort. "We should wait," he said, his voice strained, "until after the wedding." "Why? We are alone here. There is no one to judge us." "Because I want to do this right," Xander said seriously. "You deserve courtship and romance and a proper wedding night, not some rushed coupling in the wilderness." Sarah's heart melted at his unexpected traditionalism. "You're courting me then?" "I'm trying to, though I'm probably doing it wrong. I've never courted anyone before." "You're doing fine," Sarah assured him, kissing him again. "Better than fine." So they waited, though it was sweet torture sharing a bed and keeping their touches relatively chaste. Xander made up for it by being attentive in other ways, bringing her flowers he found growing wild in the canyon, cooking her favorite meals, spending hours teaching her new skills with endless patience. Sarah fell more in love with him every day. Reverend Matthews finally arrived 3 weeks after the accident, accompanied by Sheriff Morrison and, surprisingly, Mr. Calloway, who was walking with a cane but looking much healthier. "I wanted to see Miss Hartwell settled properly," Mr. Calloway explained. "After everything we went through together, it seemed only right." The wedding was simple and beautiful. Sarah wore a dress that Xander had somehow acquired from town, a simple blue cotton that fit her remarkably well. Xander wore his cleanest clothes and had trimmed his beard for the occasion. They stood together by the stream where they had first admitted their feelings, with the canyon walls rising around them and the sound of running water providing nature's music. "Do you, Xander Ironwood, take Sarah Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Matthews asked. "I do," Xander said, his voice steady and sure, his pale blue eyes locked on Sarah's face. "And do you, Sarah Hartwell, take Xander Ironwood to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Sarah said, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Xander kissed her thoroughly, to the whoops and hollers of Sheriff Morrison and Mr. Calloway. When they finally broke apart, both were grinning like fools. They shared a meal with their small wedding party, and then the visitors departed, leaving Sarah and Xander alone as husband and wife for the first time. That night, Xander was gentle and patient, taking his time to show Sarah pleasures she had never imagined. His large hands were careful on her body, worshiping every inch of her skin. And when they finally came together fully, Sarah felt complete in a way she never had before. This was where she belonged, here in Xander's arms, in this wild, beautiful place, far from the judgment and expectations of civilized society. "I love you," she whispered against his shoulder as they lay tangled together afterward. "I love you too," Xander said, the words seeming to come easier to him now, "more than I thought I could love anyone." The first year of their marriage was full of challenges and adjustments. Sarah had to learn to adapt to the harsh realities of mountain life, the bitter cold of winter when they were snowed into the canyon for weeks at a time, the scorching heat of summer when even the stream ran low, the constant work required just to survive. But she also discovered a strength in herself she had not known existed. She became proficient with the rifle, able to hunt small game on her own. She learned to tan hides and sew them into clothing and blankets. She could start a fire in any conditions and cook meals that were both nutritious and surprisingly tasty given their limited ingredients. Xander, for his part, adjusted to having another person in his life after years of solitude. He learned to talk more, to share his thoughts and feelings instead of keeping everything locked inside. The nightmares came less frequently, and when they did, Sarah was there to comfort him back to sleep. They made occasional trips to Naco for supplies, and the townsfolk grew accustomed to seeing the odd mountain couple. Sarah knew there was gossip about them, the educated woman from Philadelphia who had married a wild mountain man, but she found she truly did not care. Let them gossip. She was happier than she had ever been in her life. In the spring of their second year together, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice, and her breasts were tender, and in the mornings she felt vaguely nauseous. She waited to be certain before telling Xander, afraid of how he might react. When she finally told him one evening by the fire, his reaction was not what she expected. His face went pale, and his hands started to shake. "A baby," he said, his voice strangled. "Sarah, you could die. Women die in childbirth all the time, and we are so far from help." "Women also survive childbirth all the time," Sarah said calmly, taking his hands in hers. "I am strong and healthy. We have months to prepare. We should go to town. Stay there until the baby is born, so Doc Wells can help if something goes wrong." Sarah considered this, but shook her head. "I do not want to leave our home for months, but perhaps we could ask Doc Wells to visit regularly as I get closer to my time." They compromised. Sarah would stay in the canyon, but Xander would make frequent trips to town to consult with Doc Wells and stock up on supplies they might need. And when Sarah's time came close, the doctor would come to stay at the canyon to assist with the birth. The pregnancy was difficult at times. Sarah was sick for the first few months, barely able to keep food down. Xander hovered over her constantly, his worry palpable. But as she moved into her second trimester, she felt better, and her belly began to grow round with their child. Xander was fascinated by the changes in her body. He would place his large hands on her belly and talk to the baby, telling it stories about the mountains and the animals they might see together. At night, he would curl around her protectively, one hand always resting on her stomach. As Sarah's due date approached in late autumn, Doc Wells arrived and set up camp near their shelter. He was a jolly man who seemed to enjoy the adventure of staying in the wilderness, and his presence helped ease some of Xander's anxiety. Sarah went into labor on a cool October evening, almost exactly 2 years after the stagecoach accident that had brought her to these mountains. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Xander stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping the sweat from her forehead, his face pale with fear, but his presence steady and strong. Finally, as the sun was setting on that second day, Sarah gave one final push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. "It is a boy," Doc Wells announced, placing the squalling infant on Sarah's chest, "a healthy baby boy." Sarah looked down at her son, red-faced and furious at being born, and fell instantly in love. She looked up at Xander, who was staring at the baby with an expression of such wonder and terror that Sarah would have laughed if she had the energy. "We have a son," she said softly. "A son," Xander repeated, reaching out with one finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. Immediately, the infant grasped the finger in a tight grip, and Xander made a choked sound. "He is so small, so perfect." They named him Thomas after Sarah's father and called him Tommy. Xander took to fatherhood with the same fierce dedication he brought to everything else. He fashioned a cradle from wood and lined it with the softest furs. He would walk Tommy around the canyon for hours when the baby was fussy, singing tunelessly and pointing out birds and clouds and the shapes of the rock formations. Sarah watched her husband transform in those early months of Tommy's life. The darkness that had lurked behind his eyes for so long seemed to fade, replaced by something lighter and more hopeful. He smiled more, laughed more, seemed more at peace with himself and the world. "You are a wonderful father," Sarah told him one evening as they sat by the fire, Tommy asleep in his cradle between them. "I'm terrified every moment that I will do something wrong," Xander admitted, "that I will fail him somehow." "You will not fail him. Look at how you care for him, how gentle you are with him. He is lucky to have you as his father." Xander looked at her with such love that Sarah felt her breath catch. "I am the lucky one," he said. "You gave me a reason to hope again, Sarah. You and Tommy, you are everything I never knew I needed." The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their son's growth. Tommy took his first steps in the canyon. His first words were "Mama" and "Dada," and he grew into a curious, adventurous child who loved exploring the mountains with his father. When Tommy was 3, Sarah became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and when the time came, she delivered a daughter they named Emily, after Xander's mother. Emily had her father's pale blue eyes and her mother's blonde hair, and she wrapped both her parents around her tiny fingers from the moment she was born. Tommy adored his little sister, always wanting to help care for her and show her his favorite spots in the canyon. Watching her 2 children play together while Xander worked nearby and she prepared the evening meal, Sarah felt a contentment she had never imagined possible. They still made trips to Naco occasionally, and the children loved the excitement of town with its shops and other people. But they always returned to the canyon with relief, to the peace and beauty of their mountain home. One autumn evening when Tommy was 8 and Emily was 5, the family sat together by the fire after supper. Tommy was practicing his letters, which Sarah taught him every day, while Emily played with a doll Xander had carved for her. Xander sat beside Sarah, his arm around her shoulders, and they watched their children in companionable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" Xander asked quietly. "Staying here instead of going to town? You could have had a different life, an easier one." Sarah turned to look at her husband, taking in his weathered face and the silver that was starting to appear in his dark hair. "Not for a single moment," she said honestly. "This life, here with you and our children, it is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it." "I thank God every day for that broken stagecoach wheel," Xander said, "for sending you into my life." "Even though it nearly killed me?" Sarah teased. "Even though I would have preferred a less dramatic introduction." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I love you, Sarah Ironwood." "I love you too, Xander. Always." Tommy looked up from his letters. "Papa, will you tell us the story again about how you and Mama met?" It had become the children's favorite tale, especially Tommy, who loved the adventure of it. Xander settled back against the rock wall, and both children immediately abandoned what they were doing to curl up against their parents. "Well," Xander began, his deep voice taking on the storytelling tone he used for the children, "it was a beautiful October day, much like this one, and I was checking my trap lines when I saw something unusual." Sarah listened to her husband tell the story of their meeting, editing out the worst parts for the children's sake, and felt overwhelming gratitude for that terrible, wonderful day. The day she had thought might be her last had instead been the first day of her real life. As the fire burned low and the children grew sleepy, Sarah looked around at her family, at the canyon walls rising protectively around them, at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She thought of the frightened young woman who had fled Philadelphia with blood on her hands, who had expected nothing but loneliness and fear in her future. That woman could never have imagined this: a husband who loved her completely, children who filled her days with joy and chaos, a home that was wild and beautiful and exactly where she belonged. "Mama," Emily asked sleepily, "are you happy?" Sarah smiled and kissed her daughter's soft hair. "Yes, my darling, I am very, very happy." And it was the absolute truth. Here in these Arizona mountains, far from civilization and all its expectations, Sarah had found something precious and rare, a love that had saved her, a family that completed her, and a life that was entirely her own. The stagecoach accident that had stranded her without food had brought her to a mountain man who hunted and fed her until help arrived. But more than that, it had brought her to the man who would teach her what it meant to truly live, to love without reservation, and to build a future from the ashes of a painful past. As the family settled in for the night, Tommy and Emily in their small beds and Sarah and Xander in theirs, Sarah lay in her husband's strong arms and felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. The girl who had swung a fireplace poker in desperate self-defense was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength, who could survive anything with the right person beside her. Outside the shelter, the desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and juniper. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and in the small shelter tucked against the canyon wall, a family slept safely, protected by love and by the wild, beautiful mountains that had become their sanctuary. Years later, when Tommy and Emily were grown with children of their own, they would return to the canyon with their families. They would show their children the stream where their grandfather had taught them to fish, the rocks where they had played as children, the shelter where they had been born and raised. And they would tell the story of how their mother had come to these mountains broken and afraid, and how their father had saved her with his kindness and strength. They would tell how love had bloomed in the most unlikely of places, how two damaged souls had found healing in each other and in the wilderness. But that was still many years in the future. For now, on this October night in 1881, Sarah simply held her husband close and thanked whatever force had guided that stagecoach onto the Rocky Mountain Pass, had broken its wheel at just the right moment, had brought her into the path of a mountain man who would become her everything. She had thought she was running away when she boarded that stagecoach, but really, she had been running toward something, toward home, toward love, toward the life she was always meant to live. And as she drifted off to sleep with Xander's steady heartbeat beneath her ear, Sarah smiled. She was exactly where she belonged, exactly where she was supposed to be. The stagecoach had been stranded, but Sarah Ironwood had finally found her way home.